Yeah, I think you're right there, Davey, about identification, because I know the current statistics are around 1%, 1 in 100, but them statistics are from many years ago. They're very outdated. You know, them statistics are quite flawed for lots of reasons. And I don't think Kieran, I don't think there's many people tracking diagnostic rates, is there, at the moment?
No, I mean, particularly around the UK. I mean, there are pockets in the US that are really, really good at tracking. And there are a couple of pockets in the UK where people are tracking diagnostic rates. But, you know, it's a very, very small number of people, and extrapolations are being made from that tracking. I don't know why. I could guess at why people aren't tracking diagnostic rates. I could go down the routes of conspiracy theories, which probably have some element of truth to them. But at the end of the day, what's really important is that, you know, a lot of research is based on statistics, basically. You know, it's based on numbers, it's based on figures. And if the figures that are started with are wrong, then the research is fundamentally flawed before it's even gone anywhere. I was having a conversation the other day with, I work with a fair few psychologists and researchers and clinical psychologists, and we were talking about research the other day, autism research specifically, because quite often you have your autistic cohort in a research paper, and then you'll have your control group, your non-autistic cohort. But because nobody is tracking diagnostic rates, how do you know that there aren't a huge number of autistic people in the non-autistic cohort? So therefore it skews results, and it's kind of, you have to look at research through this view that fundamentally there are flaws in that research. But the problem is, because researchers often actively work inside a bubble, and they don't understand the impact of their research once the media picks up on it, or once people start talking about it. Flawed research is often cited in new research. You know, you look at any research paper about autism starts talking about things like theory of mind and stuff, and talks about theories that have been debunked and are outdated and have gone like years, decades and decades ago, but they're still there in modern research, and they're still based on that. And understand that's how research works. That's how academia works. You go on what was done before you. But when it's continuously being kind of this muddied water is still being put out there, and it's still being taken as verbatim by the public and by society at large, it skews everything. And that's why so many professionals are inadequately educated, for want of a nicer phrase, about autism and about autistic people. Even people who work with autistic people, you know, need to be constantly going through CPD, but they don't, because it's kind of what you were taught. Even if you qualified in 1987, that's what you then carry with you through your job and through your working life, and things never change. And I have this theory, so I'm going to waffle now. I have this theory that when you look at the autism diagnostic criteria, which again is based on, you know, a 1940s view of autism, it's very much underpinned on that, that it's actually a huge projection of society. If you think that society is really, really rigid, academia is really, really rigid, inflexible thought, there's lots of repetition, you know, everybody likes their routines, everybody likes to be in control. And it's kind of, that's why I view autism as exaggerated human behaviors. Autistic people are human, you know, and a lot of what's looked at in the diagnostic criteria is actually anxiety and anxiety driven behavior. So it's kind of, we're looking at things in very much the wrong way, and it's based on those flawed statistics. And that's a huge issue for me.
And where the statistics, I think, are really important, related to what an organisation like the Centre for Life would do. You know, you mentioned at start, Kerrie, here, that the autism rate's often been talked about as being 1 in 100. But as part of the reading of different documents and looking at different documents, I started to become aware that that figure just didn't actually sound right. And when I looked at, I converted figures to a ratio very quickly. Even when my experience in looking at things in the Newcastle area, I could see that percentage 1 in 100 was wrong. And then I started wider, and as the research built up, I saw that over the years the figures were getting bigger and bigger and bigger. I think one of the pieces of research in America suggested that the ratio was 1 in 39. So if you say it's 1 in 39 and you multiply that through the population of Europe, that means there's 18.5 million people in Europe who have autism. So, you know, but the consequences for an organisation like mine, you can't be working to support everybody all the time. You might aspire to do it, but the truth is you can't. And there's a big difference between 1% of your visitors having autism, or 2.5% of your visitors become having autism, it's a significant difference. It's a huge difference. And what it means is by having the correct figures will allow organisations, not just the Centre for Life, but other organisations to focus more on the needs of this community.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a game changer, really, isn't it? It really is.
I think as well, through not just the things like people walking through the door of organisations, but I'm working with several addiction organisations at the minute who are recognising that a lot of the people that they support in their services are at the very least neurodivergent, and a lot of them are autistic, but that's not reflective of the statistics. It's kind of, it doesn't work that way. So if you start identifying people and you start recognising true numbers of people, not only then does that mean that you can actually start modelling support services on those numbers, but you can also start identifying actually, well, if there's a significant number of people in addiction services, well, there are reasons for that. And is the reason for that the fact that they've gone undiagnosed for so long, or unrecognised, or unsupported? And, so it kind of feeds into all these other things as well. And you look at education. I mean, what Davey said there about the 1 in 39, that comes from the CDC, doesn't it, David?
Mm-hmm.
And it's the Centre for Diseases Control in America, who are the ones who track statistics of things like this. It's a horrible name, but so when you're looking at the 1 in 39, anecdotally amongst the autistic community, we're talking about figures like 1 in 15, 1 in 20 at worst, So then if you think about education, that's 2 people in every classroom. That's 2 children in every classroom. Now, quite often I've spoken to teachers who think that they've never taught an autistic person in their life, so it's once you start recognizing that we're everywhere, and the more kind of you learn about autism, the more like the scales fall off and you can't unsee what you've seen. The more you start seeing autistic people everywhere, even as you're walking down the street and interacting with people, you see they're everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
But many of us go unsupported, and many of us have mental health conditions and things like that because we're not recognized and because we're not being identified and supported.
But again, from a science basis, some of the best scientists in the world, or best mathematicians in the world, are autistic, and that's actually what makes them superb at what they do, is because they think about things differently, their cognitive behaviours differently, and they can see it in a different way. So, it's a positive thing in so many ways, and it's often unfortunately presented sometimes, or too often, as a negative thing, and it's not always a negative thing. It can be very much a positive thing.
Absolutely, and I think at North East Autism Society, we're very much around changing the language around deficits. So we're everything is about a difference rather than a deficit. It's about looking at strengths-based approaches, which is just key, because if you look at a lot of the language that's used, particularly I work a lot with families where they'll go for an initial meeting, and the language that's used about their child is absolutely heartbreaking. Things like, well, he's got a difficulty in this, he's got a deficit in this, he'll never do this, he can't do this, and all that as a parent that's just been given a diagnosis, that is just so difficult, given the lack of post-diagnostic support for that parent then to come and try and work out all the feelings around that language. So I think we're particularly pushing a big thing around changing the narrative at NEAS, which is very much around difference, not deficit, and
you have to ask yourself where that language comes from as well, and it does come from research and academia, which is the scary thing. I mean, recently I wrote an article with a lady who's she's got a master's in ethics, and she's doing a no, my words have gone. she's going to become a neurologist, basically. And the article is called Dehumanizing Rhetoric in Academia. So it's the language that they're taught and the discussions that they have amongst, what her tutors are teaching her. They had a discussion the other day, a few weeks ago, about what it means to be human. And actually they were talking about theory of mind. So theory of mind then excludes people who have dementia, people who are autistic, people who have different neurological conditions, and all of these things. So actually their definition of human excluded a huge part of humanity, and this is the thinking that's coming through, and this is backed up again by that research, by those statistics, and just the language is just awful, and it is so difficult, deficit based, but it's fundamentally because we look at things through a medicalized lens, and instead of kind of thinking about strengths-based stuff like we said at the beginning. If you look at things through a medical issue, then you are fundamentally using a narrative of broken and fix, There's
Yeah.
something, you know, so you need to fix something because it doesn't work properly, and it's flawed. It's so flawed.
And that, you know, I tell people about the dissertation that I did for my masters, and the young people in that cohort as young as 9 years old were telling me, you know, society thinks I'm broken, society thinks I need to be fixed. And you know, what does that do for a 9-year-old's mental well-being? You know, that it's just,
it's absolutely trashing. And what I loved about your research was the fact that, I mean, I knew it would happen, but the fact that you got in writing, the fact that these children are independently coming up with the things that I talk about all the time, and the adult autistic community is talking about all the time. And these are like 9-10-year-olds coming up with the same, recognizing the same patterns and the same language, and how they're demonized by society at large.
Yeah.
And it's absolutely trashing, because we take on this narrative of, you know, I'm broken, I'm not good enough, why aren't I like everybody else, why can't I do the things that other people can do, when in actual fact it needs to be flipped round, when it's, I'm not broken, why can't everyone else do the things that I can do? You know, when you start changing it around that way. It's even, this morning I was having a conversation with a parent about the fact that her doctor had told her to go and access behavioural therapies because her son hadn't hit developmental milestones, wasn't making eye contact, wasn't speaking. And I said, autistic people, you know, we all have neurology. Autistic neurology is a little bit different. Sometimes it takes us longer to learn things. Sometimes it takes a little bit less to learn things. Sometimes there's other issues like apraxia of speech and motor issues, which aren't investigated, but it's assumed the child's just not talking. You know, so why put your child for all these reams of therapy you're being recommended, when in actual fact you can just support them to be themselves and find positive therapies that are going to look at strengths-based and focus on what they're good at, and then that will bring up any perceived deficits and weaknesses. You know, it's just a messed up way of looking at things.